So be here. So hello everyone, welcome. So we're staying here because the camera is here. So the online audience and also audience here and our team member, thank you very much for your coming. So this is our GRIFE Finnish Education and Global Perspective Seminar. And it's organized by our Global Research Institute for Finnish, European and Global South Education. We call it GRIFE. At the University of Hong Kong. Welcome all of you join this seminar. And today we invited our guest speaker and Dr. Ollie Pepper Malinen. And he is our guest to visit our center and also our university. Welcome.
Yes, thank you.
And he's the director of a master degree program. And actually, I talked with and knowing that there's more than 1,000 students in your program, which is a large group of students in Finland. And he is the university lecturer in special needs education at the University of Helsinki, Faculty of Education Science. Currently, he is also served as the Finnish chair of, we call it Sino-Finnish Joint Learning Innovation Institute, JOLI, right? Yes, it's very famous organization to connect Finland and China and Asia or different kind of academic activities. During his career, and Malinen had worked as a researcher, school teacher, teacher educator, international education expert, and the vice director of the Multidisciplinary Research Institute. And now I think it's time to give to our guest to tell us more about today's topic. And also the inclusive education is very important in Hong Kong, in Asia. And of course, we have some new programs in NHK also related to inclusive education. And his topic attracts a lot of audience because the topic is Teacher's Perspective to Inclusive Education Overview of 15 years of research from Finland, East Asia, and South Africa. Welcome.
Yes, thank you. And I would like to check that do the online participants hear me. So in case you hear me, maybe someone can write to the chat that my sound is okay. So just checking. Yes, very clear. Thank you. So I think that's then solved. So we are here online and on site, and there may be some people coming in. So please do not be too disturbed, online participants. And as my colleague Annie just explained, I'm going to talk about the research I've been doing with my colleagues on inclusive education, particularly from teachers' perspective. And then it was also a kind of helpful exercise for me to do a small recap of the work I've been doing basically since my own PhD work, which I concluded in 2013, so about 12 years ago. And I also try not to put too much into this presentation because it can be a bit overwhelming. This is mostly the statistical models that I've used, but I try also to explain those models so that those who are not that familiar with the research methods that I've been using can follow the presentation. Okay, and does this work? Let me see the clicker. Okay, so now it works. So this is the rough outline of the presentation. So I will tell a few words about myself first, so that you know where I'm coming from, sort of professionally. Then a few words about inclusive education, but as I think many of you are already somewhat familiar with this inclusive education agenda, I won't spend too much time on that. Then a few examples of the research that I've been doing with my colleagues on the topic of inclusive education from teachers' perspective. And then the research that we have been doing, the data has been collected in many countries, mainly from Finland, then from a few countries in East Asia, I'm meaning from mainland China and Japan. And then also some data from South Africa, which I'm not going to talk so much today. And then some final thoughts concerning this area of research that I'm doing, I'm presenting today. Now, some words about my own sort of professional background. So I thought that maybe this is one of the three three layers or three areas that have influenced myself and how I see these topics. So I'm originally trained as a special needs teacher in Finland and worked some time as a special class teacher there in some public school in Finland. But after that, I've been doing quite much teacher training, which I'm doing at the moment as my work, but also teacher professional development, not only in Finland, but also for teachers from other parts of the world. So yes, for example, you can see me in mainland China doing what we called the Finnish School Day Tour. So we were teaching a typical Finnish school day to a class of local kids. I believe this is from Chengdu, maybe in Sichuan province in Kazakhstan, and then also some groups of teachers from China visiting Finland some years ago. A program on inclusive education that I sort of designed with my colleagues. Then I think this has also influenced me quite much, the professional experiences I've had outside of Finland. So as a master's student already, I was exchange student in Hainan Island, Haikou, so not geographically not that far from here. Later, I continued doing my PhD research when I lived in mainland China and collected most of the data I used in my PhD thesis from Beijing and also from some other areas like Chongqing in China. And then with my family, I've also lived in the Netherlands and USA for a while and had our kids going to school or early childhood education in those countries. And I think it's always helpful to get more perspective also as a parent how education is done in other countries. And then the third area I've highlighted here is the research and publications that I've been doing on this topic of inclusive education, both in Finnish and English languages. Both research papers, but also some manuals like here, the Finnish manual on co-teaching an inclusive classroom, which I think has been quite popular material with those teachers who want to try the co-teaching in their own schools and classrooms. Now, I said that I'm not going to dwell too much into this topic of inclusive education agenda because I know that many of you are already quite familiar with it, but just listed a few global milestones of inclusive education, starting from the Convention Against Discrimination in Education, the World Declaration on Education for All, the Salamanca Statement of 1994, the Dhaka Framework for Action, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and then maybe as a latest milestone, the Incheon 2030 Declaration and Framework for Action. So just to highlight that inclusive education is kind of a global phenomenon, and there are, I would say, a large share of the countries in the world are somehow committed to it, and it makes it quite interesting research topic because the phenomenon is found in almost everywhere in the world, but then how it materializes in practice, how it looks at the schools can be quite different. And then I think it's a kind of indication of this global interest that it seems that whatever we have published in English research papers on these topics, they always get or usually get quite many citations, even though I don't know if the research is so special or so impressive, but I think the topic is the kind of topic that interests quite a few people in around the world, and that's maybe why it seems to be that this research also is quite highly cited. Now, and then as I said, most countries in the world are somehow dedicated into this inclusive education agenda, and one example is this UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And with red color or painted with red color, you can see the countries that have already ratified this convention. Maybe the most important exception from this is the United States, which at least when I checked the last time hadn't yet ratified, signed but not ratified this convention. But you could say that the vast majority of the countries in the world have ratified the convention. Then of course it's a different question how the rights of persons with disabilities are materialized, for example, in the schools. in these countries. It's usually in presentations like this, you need to define the concepts, and that's why I took this UNESCO definition of inclusive education. So inclusive approach to education means that each individual's needs are taken into account and that all learners participate and achieve together. And it acknowledges that all children can learn and every child has unique characteristics, interests, abilities, and learning needs. Special focus is placed on learners who may be at risk of marginalization, exclusion, and underachievement. And I would see that this UNESCO definition is quite broad, of course, because it has to cover sort of the situation in a very wide range of countries. So it doesn't take too much stance on what are the reasons of marginalization, exclusion, or underachievement. That can be different in different countries, or those can differ. It takes the stance that all learners should have right to participate and also achieve. So which I guess it means that achieve in their own level or taking account their own starting point. Now then, yet another perspective to inclusive education. This is kind of already a quite not old but mature perspective. Is this division between the inclusive education in the global north and inclusive education in the global south, meaning that in the global north there has been a separate special education system to start with, and inclusive education agenda is many times about diminishing the role of special or separate special education system. So maybe closing down the separate special education schools and bringing students from those schools into regular schools. While in the global south, there hasn't been no separate special education system to start with. So then inclusive education, it wouldn't make sense to close down any special education schools because they haven't existed in the first place. So in the global south, you could say that it's more about the providing support for all vulnerable groups and perhaps even building some new special education schools which haven't been existing, and then using them as resource centers for the mainstream education. And I'm more familiar with the inclusive policies in the mainland China, but I believe that has been the approach in mainland China, that at least based on the official statistics, the number of special education schools has been growing not very fast, but slowly in mainland China. And there the idea is that those special education schools would act as resource centers for that support the work on inclusion in the mainstream schools. But then maybe this could be a reason why I think this topic seems to be quite interesting around the world. I actually on the aeroplane. So yesterday when I came to Hong Kong, I did some, not really an analysis, but I downloaded the before my trip this latest TALIS 2024 data, and then just looked at what do the teachers around the world consider as areas where they need further professional development. And those who are not familiar with this TALIS data, I would say that it's almost like a PISA study, but for teachers. So it's perhaps the largest international comparative study on teachers. And the latest data was collected just last year, 2024, and it covered 55 countries and economies, about 17,000 schools, and nearly 300,000 teachers around the world. Unfortunately, Hong Kong wasn't part of this latest data collection round of TALIS, so I couldn't show you any figures from Hong Kong. The closest jurisdiction to Hong Kong was, I believe it was Shanghai, so I kind of checked the Shanghai figures just to have some East Asian perspective here. And when we asked the TALIS teachers, so here I've lumped together all of those 55 education systems and countries. So this data represents I would say, the global perspective of those secondary education teachers. And when asking that teachers that where do you see the highest need for professional development? No, you might have guessed that this round, the artificial intelligence, the teachers saw as the highest need area, but quite close, or actually very close to that area, was teaching students with special education needs. So it seems that teachers around the world, they acknowledge that this is the area where we need more training, where we need more skills. And I think that's one justification that why it's important to talk about the teacher's perspective to inclusive education. Then I checked the Finnish figures. They look quite the same. Maybe the averages, the means are a bit lower than in that global data set. Also in Finland, skills for using artificial intelligence came first. But then I've circulated with this red color those who are the second, third, fourth, and 5 highest need areas. And I think all of those are somehow linked to inclusive education. So methods for supporting students' social emotional learning, teaching students with special needs, classroom management for student behavior, approaches to individualized learning. So at least I tend to think that these are all areas and skills that teachers in inclusive education classroom should know about. Then, as I said, there was no data from Hong Kong, so I took the Shanghai data as to represent sort of this geographical region. And it was interesting to know, for some reason, the Shanghai averages, the means were quite high. So it seemed that they want training in all of these areas. But then the teaching student with the special needs was quite bottom. The means are not that different, but still, for some reason, it looks like these Shanghai teachers, they wanted to know more about pedagogical skills for incorporating digital resources and tools, the pedagogy of the subject matters I teach, technical skills for the use of digital resources and tools, and so on. I'm not sure if this reflects more broadly the thinking, but it looks like maybe the Shanghai teachers may more focus on teaching their own subject, the subject knowledge, than things like teaching students with special needs. But I wouldn't take too strong conclusions, because as we can see that the means are quite the same there, so there weren't that big of a differences between these areas in this Shanghai data. Now then, going to my own research or research I've been doing with my colleagues, and then this kind of a timeline of the areas that we have covered. Now here it stops at 2024, but actually we have already published some research in this area 2025 as well. So cross-cultural exploration of teacher self-efficacy and attitudes is something that we've been doing, and I did also in my own PhD research. Longitudinal investigation on the effects of teacher efficacy on a range of teacher and student outcomes. And then maybe the most recent is to applying the theory of planned behavior in the context of inclusive education. And first, going to this cross-cultural exploration of teacher self-efficacy and attitudes. These are the countries that we've been focusing in our research the most. So there's Finland, then there is the mainland China, and then there is Japan, where I had one PhD student investigating inclusive education in Japan, and then South Africa, where we have worked together with South African colleagues. And the first sort of the question I try to answer with the research that we have been doing is, how does teacher self-efficacy for inclusive practices predict the teacher's attitudes towards inclusive education? And those who are not that familiar with the self-efficacy, the concept of self-efficacy, it basically means that how capable the teachers themselves feel they are in implementing inclusive education, or how strong is their own self-efficacy in sort of doing the things that are required from a teacher that teaches inclusive classrooms. And theoretically, the theory of self-efficacy was developed by Albert Bandura, a psychologist that passed away a few years ago. And theoretically, self-efficacy is built from 4 sources. So from master experiences, so being having experiences of accomplishment, let's say, in teaching in inclusive settings, that should build your self-efficacy. The second source is vicarious experiences, so observing your colleagues or other teachers or people in similar kind of situations with similar background to seeing them to master some skill or being successful in inclusive teaching. Then there's the verbal persuasion, which means that some other people give you positive feedback, encouragement. Let's say that, yes, you can do it. You can teach this student, or did you see how well you manage this classroom situation, and so on. And then there are the somatic and emotional states, meaning that, for example, if you feel anxious before coming to teach a class, do you interpret it positively? Yes, it's great that I'm a bit anxious because it means that I care about what I'm doing, or do you interpret it as in a way that I'm so anxious that I'm certainly going to fail? So this all can influence your self-efficacy to a negative or positive direction. But then going to this multicultural or cross-country comparison of inclusive education and teachers' perspective to it, I had taken this one study we concluded with colleagues from South Africa and mainland China, exploring teacher self-efficacy for inclusive practices in 3 diverse countries, and these countries were Finland, mainland China, and then South Africa. And we had participants, about 855 teachers from Finland, 451 teachers from China, and then 605 teachers from South Africa. We measured the self-efficacy for inclusive practices, and then we measured the attitudes towards inclusive education. And these scales were actually developed, or one of the developers was Professor Christine Fallin, who used to work in this institute. So we had that kind of link also to the Education University of Hong Kong, which was in, I think, Institute of Education, the name. And then we did some confirmatory factor analysis and a structural equation question modeling, so statistical analysis with this questionnaire data. For this, I won't go too much into detail, but let's say these were the items of our teacher self-efficacy measure. So things like I'm able to provide alternate explanation or example when students are confused, and this was item in the self-efficacy in instruction dimension of this scale. Then things like I can make parents feel comfortable coming to school, and this was an item in our inclusive self-efficacy in collaboration dimension of this scale. And then I'm able to calm a student who is disruptive or noisy, and this item was in the behavior management dimension of the scale. Altogether 18 items and 3 factors or dimensions, as I said, inclusive efficacy in inclusive instruction, efficacy in collaboration, and efficacy in managing difficult student behavior. And what we found that this structure that we expected, it was actually replicated in all of these 3 countries. So in Finland, South Africa, and China, we found that yes, actually you could divide the self-efficacy in inclusive education into these 3 dimensions. So there was efficacy in inclusive instruction, efficacy in collaboration, and efficacy in managing behavior. These 3 dimensions found in all of these 3 countries. This data is the Chinese data and then the factor loadings and fit statistics and so on. And what we also found that these dimensions correlate quite highly. So all of these 3 dimensions of self-efficacy, they are also connected to each other quite strongly. Now then, when we tested that with these 3 dimensions of self-efficacy and which one of these or how they are linked to teacher attitudes towards inclusive education. And what we found out that actually the efficacy in collaboration had the strongest connection on attitudes towards inclusive education. So in practice, it would mean that those teachers who felt that they are able to collaborate with the parents, with their colleagues in their schools, with other professionals such as school psychologists or counselors, they had more positive attitudes towards inclusive education. Now, of course, we may not have data to show that why is it so, at least in this data set, but I've been speculating that maybe it is so that inclusive education is such a daunting task, such a demanding task for a teacher, that if you feel that I'm able to seek help, I'm able to collaborate with my colleagues, I'm able to get support from other professionals like school psychologists or counselors, then having students with disabilities or special educational needs in my own classroom feels less threatening, or I see it more positively. And actually, I was kind of surprised that it was the efficacy in collaboration that was the strongest predictor. But we saw it all of these 3 countries. I think this data is probably from the Chinese data, but we saw the same thing in Finland and South Africa. So I think that's maybe a kind of a bit stronger proof that this may be a kind of universal phenomenon, that this efficacy in collaboration is actually quite important, that the teachers feel they are capable of collaborating. Now then, the second question here is, what effect do school climate, teacher self-efficacy and collective efficacy have on teacher job satisfaction and burnout? And here the question we posed was partially because, at least in Finland, the teachers often thought that it's quite exhausting to have these diverse classrooms to teach. It's quite exhausting to have students with special educational needs in your own classroom. So we wanted to see if this self-efficacy and collective efficacy have some connection to the feeling of burnout or the feeling of job satisfaction, which is of course a positive thing if you are feeling satisfied with your job. And here we use data from Finland. We had a large-scale study called ProCol study. This large study was about developing so-called school-wide positive behavior practices in Finnish schools. But here we just used this opportunity that we had a lot of collaborating schools, a lot of students and teachers answering our surveys, and studied this question that I just showed. Most of the schools were there in the eastern part of Finland. I've here cut into half the Finland, so there's still Finland above, but this region, and then some secondary schools also from central Finland and even western Finland. And the dataset had about 2,000 teachers and 10,000 students. And we had because it was quite a large project, we had a whole research team. I've just listed some of the colleagues who were part of this project. And you could also see me as a slightly younger man there in the photo. And this is the article where the results that I'm going to show have been published. So in this article, we use data from secondary school teachers. We had 642 teachers from 38 lower secondary schools. And then we had longitudinal data with 3 measurement points. And the data was collected about 10 years ago from these secondary schools. So from 2013 to 2014, no, actually 11 years ago. And we measured the teacher's job satisfaction, their burnout or their so-called emotional exhaustion, the school climate, teachers' efficacy in managing behavior in the classroom, and also collective efficacy in managing behavior. And by collective efficacy, I mean here that what do you feel that the teachers together in the school can do to prevent disruptive student behavior or manage the difficult student behavior, challenging student behavior that occurs in the school? And this is the kind of the statistical model that we came up with. I can here explain. So we had the school climate. So this was measured at one time point at the beginning of the school year. And the school climate consisted of 4 dimensions, which were collaboration, student relationship, decision-making processes in the school, and instructional innovation at the school. And here we would have also the individual questionnaire items, but I haven't listed them here because it would make the image too complicated. So we had school climate measured at the beginning of the school year. Then we had self-efficacy and collective efficacy measured at the middle of the school year. And then we had job satisfaction and burnout measured at the end of the school academic year in those schools. And what we found here that the school climate at the beginning of the school year, the perceived school climate, seemed to have quite strong connection to self-efficacy in the middle of the school year, and especially to collective efficacy in the middle of the school year. So if the teachers perceive the school climate, they felt that there's a positive school climate, then also they had more positive self-efficacy and collective efficacy in the middle of the school year. And then we could also see that the self-efficacy management behavior had a positive interactions or positive effect on job satisfaction at the end of the school year. So teachers who had higher self-efficacy in managing behavior were more satisfied with their job. And it also had a negative effect on burnout. So teachers who felt that they have teachers who had higher self-efficacy in managing behavior, they had lower burnout or rates of burnout at the end of the school year. Of course, these models, they never can explain all the variation. They cannot provide complete explanations for. So for example, here, this model explained about 13% of the variation in the burnout, and this model explained about 24% of the variation on job satisfaction. So there was still quite a lot of unexplained variation here. And it was also interesting that the school climate at the beginning of school year also explained the job satisfaction at the end of the school year. So it's kind of what you have guessed, but this is like showing with longitudinal data that the positive school climate seems to also lead to more job satisfaction, even when we are following these teachers from the beginning of the school year to the end of the school year. So this is just putting in words what we found here. So, as I said, self-efficacy in behavior management, it had effect on job satisfaction and burnout, and it also mediated the effect of the school climate. So it also acted as a mediator of the school climate to the job satisfaction and burnout. And then the school climate at the beginning of school year did not directly predict burnout, but as I said, the self-efficacy kind of mediated part of the effect of the school climate also. And the collective efficacy did not affect this burnout or job satisfaction, or did it? Let me see. It didn't. Yes, I remembered correctly. So we kind of speculated that it seems to be that this burnout is still a kind of an individual level phenomenon. So self-efficacy, which means how I feel myself, I'm capable of doing these tasks. It seemed to explain the burnout, but collective efficacy did not. And one reason may be also that in Finland the variation between the schools is not that big. So almost, I would say that most schools are about the same in Finland. So then the variation is more in the individuals. In individuals in schools, you have some teachers with high self-efficacy, some teachers with low self-efficacy. But you seldom see schools where all teachers would have very high self-efficacy, and some schools where all teachers would have very low self-efficacy. At least based on our data, these high and lower self-efficacy teachers are quite evenly scattered in the schools in our data sets. Now then, it would be the yet another question. What are kind of longitudinal relationships do teacher self-efficacy for inclusive practices and attitude towards inclusive education have? So if here in the earlier study I showed, we used cross-sectional data to investigate the relationship. Later, we were fortunate enough to have longitudinal data to investigate this question. And these results have been published in this data. We had one Finnish colleague and then Susanne Schwab, who is now working in Austria in University of Vienna, if I remember correctly. And we used data from that local study, so what I showed earlier in the map, a large-scale longitudinal study. And we had data here in this study from 7 time points. So from academic year 2013-14, 2014-15, 2015-16, and 2016-17. And from the first 3 academic years, we had data from autumn and spring, the Finnish autumn and spring terms. And then from this 4th academic year, we had data only from autumn because the project ended after that. And we had this kind of a randomized grouping here, but which we didn't use in this data, but we had groups, schools group in different groups. One group starting this behavior intervention a bit earlier, but I'm not going to talk about the intervention that much today. Only just using the data to explain some other questions. So in this study that I'm showing, we are using this 6 time points from 3 academic years, data from 6 time points, 2 time points per academic year. And the measures or the constructs we are using here is teacher self-efficacy and attitudes towards inclusive education. We had also in our questionnaires scales and measures to assess all of these constructs, but here we only use those 2 constructs that I've highlighted or are bolded there, teacher self-efficacy and attitudes towards inclusive education. But then we used what we call a cross-lagged panel model. So here this T1, T2, T3, T4, T5, T6, they refer to the time points. There's about half a year interval between these time points. And then we studied there were the teacher concerns related to inclusive education, so one kind of a attitude dimension here. Then we had teacher self-efficacy related to inclusive education. And then we had those same things measured in different time points. But this figure it has quite a lot of arrows and quite a lot of these numbers, which are, by the way, the standardized regression coefficients, meaning that the higher the value, the stronger the connection between those constructs which are connected by the arrows. But to highlight just a few, I would say that it seems to be that over time, these concerns were quite stable. So teachers who were concerned at the beginning of the data collection, this seemed to be quite stable. So they continue to be concerned, have concerns over inclusive education over time. And also the self-efficacy was quite stable as well. So teacher self-efficacy measured at time point 2 had really strong connection to the teacher self-efficacy measured at time point 3. Then the connection was slightly weaker, but still it seemed to be quite stable. So those teachers who had high self-efficacy, it seemed to remain quite high over time. But what was interesting was that there was some of this cross-lag effect. So actually, the teacher self-efficacy seemed to have some influence on attitudes, but over time. So teacher self-efficacy seemed to have a positive effect on attitudes. If you had higher self-efficacy, you had more positive attitudes. And let me see, and it seemed to be the stronger the effect from teacher self-efficacy to attitudes than from attitudes to teacher self-efficacy. And when we measured this, we had 2 kind of dimensions of attitudes. This was more about how does it feel to have students of special education needs in your own classroom. Here we can see that it was from efficacy to attitudes a positive relationship, but not so much from attitudes to self-efficacy. And I feel that is kind of important finding, or at least interesting finding. I'm maybe biased to say if it's important or not. So both teacher self-efficacy for inclusive practices and attitudes towards inclusive education, as I said, were relatively stable over time when we followed those teachers for 3 academic years. Self-efficacy had a positive effect over time on both of these attitude dimensions, so concerns over inclusive education, and then attitudes towards, let's say, having students with disabilities or special educational needs in your own classroom. But not vice versa, so attitudes didn't predict teacher self-efficacy as strongly. So it seems that if we increase teacher self-efficacy, it will likely have at least some positive effect also on their attitudes. And I think this is interesting because a very strong line of research or area of research in inclusive education has been these teacher attitudes towards inclusive education. But at least based on this result, it seems that maybe it's not as efficient to try to change the teacher attitudes. Maybe it can also be done in a way that you provide teachers these skills and positive experiences of inclusive education so that it builds their teacher self-efficacy. And that way also the attitudes may become more positive or change toward positive direction. Now then, let me see how much time I have. Maybe I won't. This might be the final sort of study that I will share, not to overload you. There's still one in slides, but let's see if we want to go into that. Now this was a study that we published last year, but actually I started doing it almost 10 years ago. It had a quite long process. One reason was that there was several years that I wasn't doing that much active research. I was working in a sort of education consultancy company, and then when I rejoined the academia, I also sort of reinvigorated the study that I had started earlier. But luckily it was published last year because it was kind of a headache for me not to finalize it in several years. So here the question is that what is the effect of teacher self-efficacy in behavior management on classroom behavioral climate? So the self-efficacy in behavior management, so feeling that can I prevent disruptive behavior, can I manage challenging behavior, what kind of effect does that have on the behavioral climate in the classroom? While controlling the effects of earlier classroom behavioral climate, some class composition variables and teacher characteristics. And the reason of having this question is that while the teacher self-efficacy has been studied a lot, there's surprisingly little research or has been on the effect of teacher self-efficacy on student outcomes, be it academic outcomes or behavioral outcomes or social emotional outcomes. So we tend to think that teacher self-efficacy is important, but then we know surprisingly little what effect does it have on classrooms or students in those classrooms. So this is just a quote from a review study that was done by Klassen and colleagues. It was published already 2011, but I would say that the situation is kind of similar still today, that there isn't that much study on the effect of teacher efficacy on student outcomes. And there are some limitations of the earlier research. Just to highlight a few, many of the studies, they have used cross-sectional data. So then it's harder to show effects or have this causality established. And many of the studies have also used only teacher self-reported data. While we, using the same data set that I already represented and having these 6 time points, which I bolded here, we had data from students who assessed the classroom behavioral climate. And then we had data from their class teachers who assessed their own teacher self-efficacy in managing behavior. And now it becomes a bit complicated to explain the research design, but I try. So we had the behavior management subscale of this teacher self-efficacy or inclusive practice scale, both spring and autumn from teachers. Then we had classroom behavioral climate assessment from students, both spring and autumn. And then only autumn, we had some teacher characteristics like gender, teaching experience, and we had some class composition variables like the number of students in a class or proportion of students with significant attention and or behavior problems. Now, these are the example items of this efficacy managing behavior scale. These are some of the items in this classroom behavioral climate scale, like it is too noisy during a lesson, so things that the students assessed. We had quite strict sample selection criteria, not going too much into detail, but for example, we wanted to have classes which have only one classroom teacher, because if you had 2, then it's hard to know which one of those teachers will have more influence to the class. And then we also wanted to have classes which are not special education classes, so only regular classes. Then we wanted to have classes where most of the students were the same over time. So if the students change, it's hard, you cannot say that it's the same class anymore, and so on. And then the 7th thing here can be a bit tricky, is that we wanted to have teachers who did not teach this target class at the time of the first measurement, but did teach the class at the time of the second measurement. So idea was that because the teacher hadn't taught the class when we measured it the first time, the teacher had not had any time to have influence to the class because they haven't been together. But then at the second time, the teacher had taught the class for about 3 months. So then we could say that if the teacher has had an effect on the class, it must have happened during these 3 months, because that's the only time that the teacher and the class have spent together. In some earlier studies, they have used data where the teacher had taught the class maybe even several years before the first data collection point. And then it's hard to say whether the effect happened before the study even started or after during the study, because the teacher and class had been together so long time already when the researchers started to collect their data. Now then we had a small problem of because we wanted to do so-called multi-level modeling, and we had this strict selection criteria that I just showed. So we had to pull data together a little bit. So we pulled data together from all of these academic years, so that if we had data from a certain teacher in spring 2000 2014, we took that data, but if we had data from another teacher from spring 2015, then we took data from that teacher, and if we had this kind of data from yet another teacher or class from spring 2016, then we took that data and we kind of found this spring data and then this autumn data, and between this there was always a summer break, but kind of, and then dealt those spring data, even though they're from different academic years, and those autumn data, even well, that was pulled from different academic years, kind of a one measurement point in our model. So these are the sample characteristic: 1,010 students, 75 classes, 75 class teachers, and then 2 measurement points from each student and class teacher, as I said. And here showing that we had this student-rated classroom behavioral climate measured in spring, and then teacher self-efficacy managing behavior measured in spring, summer break, and then the same variables. And in the first time point, the teacher and target class not yet together, and the second point, teacher and target class had been together for 3 months. And then we did what is called the kind of the multi-level, 2-level modeling, just to take into account that the students are nested within these classes. So probably students within the same class are more similar to each other than students in different classes. And we are here focusing on this between class level analysis or part of the analysis. So just to make the image larger and highlight what I think is the most important is that while controlling the effect of this classroom and teacher characteristics like teaching experience, teacher gender, proportion of female students in the class, number of students, teaching experience in current school, proportion of students with attention and behavior problems, teacher self-efficacy in behavior management still had a statistically significant effect on classroom behavioral climate, which means that if you had a teacher who had higher self-efficacy in managing behavior, after 3 months, the students seemed to, 3 months of this teacher having taught the class, the students seemed to rate their classroom behavioral climate more positively. The students felt there's less disruptive behavior in their classroom and more positive behavior in their classroom. But there wasn't a similar kind of statistically significant effect the other way around. So classroom behavioral climate over time did not seem to explain teacher self-efficacy in behavior management. And here we also saw this same stability we saw in the earlier model. So teacher self-efficacy in behavior management explained quite strongly the later teacher self-efficacy, even though the class that the teacher was working with, the class that teacher was teaching changed here. So that kind of shows that teacher self-efficacy seemed to be quite stable. And the same here with classroom behavioral climate. Even if the teacher changes, those classes where there's disruptive behavior seem to kind of stay as like that over time, even though the teacher changes. So here is some discussion of this finding, which I don't want to go too much into detail. One explanation why we found here effect from teacher self-efficacy to this classroom climate where earlier studies hadn't found. I think one reason may be that here we had class teachers, which in Finnish system, they are teaching most of the lessons in primary school to this one class. So they typically spend at least 20 hours together with this class, while earlier studies had used many times the subject teacher samples, where the teacher spends much less time with the class. And then the other reason here why we saw effect while the earlier studies haven't shown effect from teacher efficacy to student outcomes is maybe that we had this research design that we had teachers who had not taught the class before the first measurement, while in earlier studies they usually had teachers who had taught the class before the data collection started. Now this, as I said, there's no meaning to rush too much through this study, because it's yet another kind of complicated model to explain. But let's just say that this is an article that we published this year, and it's related to applying the theory of planned behavior in the context of inclusive education. And there should be another paper coming out on this same topic later this maybe next year. But maybe just to conclude here to the final thoughts. So these are more like my own thoughts. So during the last 15 years, and actually much longer, teacher perceptions on inclusive education have been quite active area of research. However, a large share of the studies seem to repeat the same questions and research designs. For example, one very common question is, do teachers hold positive or negative attitudes towards inclusive education? And we kind of already know the answer there. The typical answer is that teachers may be positive generally towards the idea of inclusive education, but when you ask to take those students in your own classroom, the teachers tend to be more negative in their attitudes. But fortunately, there is a considerable output of research which has more novel research questions, kind of more sophisticated designs and methods, also some longitudinal data, and then also maybe have more solid theoretical foundation. So as a conclusion, you could say that the research field moves forward, maybe a bit slower than one might wish for, but at least I see some development also in this area of inquiry. And this was kind of what I had prepared for. No, I have only CS here. I think it's in Fanti, it's a bit different, but in my laptop I only had the GNT. So thank you and kiitos in Finnish. I hope to see some snow when I return back home. There wasn't any snow when I left, but it's Christmas time, so I'm dreaming of white Christmas here. But I think I've covered all my time, maybe even something extra, so maybe it's time for us to stop here.
Thank you so much for the Dr. Ali, Pekka, and Malinen, and thank you so much for your wonderful experience in sharing. I think the topic showed us about 15 years, actually more than 15 years. So maybe our audience have some questions, and you can speak. Actually, you can talk in Chinese. Yeah, Dr. Malinen can speak 普通话、中文非常流利。今天中午我们吃饭的时候，一整个小时我们都可以用 Chinese. We can use talk in 1 hour in Chinese. You cannot believe that. So that's Thailand, and also good opportunity. You can ask any questions in different language. Just be free to talk. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So, are there any questions in the chat or here on site?
See, perfect. First one.
Okay, so it's a high volume. We cannot do much about it now.
This audience from Yuzhong is from another institute in Hong Kong. So any questions? Welcome, all team members or different. And also the center directors here for our SCN, Professor Xin and your guests. So welcome. So any question or comments? Just what wish to talk.
I did not have any question, but as a
maybe microphone.
Appreciation, wonderful.
It's quite a comprehensive presentation for telling us the past 20 or 30 years what inclusive education is going on. I think that's good.
Yeah, maybe you need to microphone if the online people are still there.
I hope that the audience can hear me. It's a very serendipity situation because I know very well Umesh Sharma and I understand perfectly your presentation because I I took part in some international study about collective efficacy conducted by Umesh Sharma and also the group from Switzerland that works on collective self-efficacy perceived by special ed teachers. So I really appreciate your study, your presentation, and for me was almost everything very clear. I also know Tim Lerman, so I know the theory beyond this study. I can ensure that there's a strong model beyond this presentation, and also that the interest to investigate how perceived self-individual and collective efficacy impact on attitudes toward inclusive practice is a common problem in Europe, not only in Finland, but also in other countries. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, I didn't mention it, but my own PhD dissertation was also part of this international comparative project where we had some European countries and the South Africa and China. So it seems to be a topic that is of interest in many parts of the world. And the names that you mentioned, Umesh Sharma and Tim Loreman, they are kind of part of the same team that is Christine Forlin. So Umesh from Australia, maybe now in mainland China, I believe, a professor. Yeah, and then Tim Loreman in Canada. So also this kind of cross-national team.
Yeah, especially our program last year review, then a lot of employers and graduates that mentioned about the special needs and inclusive. Yeah, I think it's much more of attention has been poured for this.
And it's also something that our students in our bachelor and master's programs many times mention as an area where they would need to know more about and need more skills. Okay, then there's a question that are there any studies planned or undertaking related to pre-service teacher attitudes and self-efficacy related to inclusive education? So this was a question in chat, and I can say that there are already many studies on pre-service teachers' self-efficacy. I've also done some. So for example, in my PhD dissertation, I had data from Chinese pre-service teachers, but it's also a very active area of inquiry. One question though there is that when you are measuring the self-efficacy of pre-service teachers, how reliable is that assessment? Because some of those may not have much experience in actually teaching students. And then it's a question that where do they base what is the sort of the comparison point of their self-efficacy when they may not have that much own experience. And sometimes you even see that the before graduation pre-service teacher self-efficacy is quite high, but after they enter the schools and start teaching, it can become lower. But I would maybe say it may become more realistic because then they actually find out what they can do, while before they actually enter the teaching, they may have like an unreasonably high self-efficacy sense.
It's a good point. Thank you. Yeah. It's great time. You have a question? Yes, I think we have.
Yeah, one more, and of course, online participants. Maybe you can take microphone. There's no way of me stopping you from leaving. So in case you have to go, of course, everyone is free to go. But we can take one more question. Yeah.
I have to get another meeting.
Yeah, Kirosh. So I was a secondary school teacher from mainstream school, and then I'm very interested in the burnout level of the teachers because I experienced that too in my previous school. And then I'm thinking like when you travel across different countries, have you noticed that there is a difference between the burnout level of teachers in China and of teachers in Finland?
No, I cannot tell because I actually don't have burnout data from China. Maybe in the Tally survey, actually, I think they have some burnout measures. But it would take 2 hours, maybe 1 hour to do some preliminary analysis. But I can say that, for example, in the earlier data sets of this Tally's data, for example, we have seen that teachers in East Asian countries overall seem to work quite long hours. So if we think that working more hours is linked to burnout, which I think have to be, then maybe there's a higher risk of burnout in East Asian region. Because compared to, for example, the Finland, the teachers in Japan or Shanghai seem to work longer hours. But I think in general in Finland, for example, most teachers are not actually burned out. They are quite satisfied and happy with their work, in Finland at least. Yeah. But of course, there are some teachers, and even like having a handful of teachers in schools is more than we would wish for.
I think time is up. Some our audience already have
Yes.
other duties, but keep the conversation going on, and you can connect or read the papers.
Yeah.
I find
Yeah.
one good point that I find is very encouraging. You can use longitudinal and the data collected 10 years ago is still valid, and also try to create more thinking. That's really, really good point to encourage us. Thank you.
And if someone wants to contact me, you just Google my name, University of Helsinki, and I'm quite sure you can find my profile page, and there are email address and so on.
Thank you so much for coming. All right. Enjoy the afternoon, and glad to appreciate this seminar and the GRIFE organization, our colleagues. Thank you so much. And that's the audience.
And I can see also one of the PhD researchers I'm supervising, the Angel. So it's nice to have some representations on Finland/Korea.
Yes. Welcome to Hong Kong. If you have any opportunity, and enjoy the afternoon. Thank you so much, and see you next time.
Okay, see you.